Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chair Robert Menendez was among Tuesday's speakers at the AIPAC conference. He focused on Iran's nuclear program, saying he supports diplomacy, but sanctions should remain in place. He also touched on the situation in Ukraine and the aid package being worked on by his committee. This is 25 Minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome former AIPAC President Lonnie Kaplan.
This morning, we are honored to welcome one of the true leaders in the United States Senate. For 13 years in the House, 7 in the Senate, and as the current chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Robert Menendez has been one of America's most outspoken figures on behalf of freedom around the world and in the quest to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapons capability. From being the lead sponsor on legislation to delivering powerful floor speeches, the Senator's focus, dedication, and leadership on this issue are second to none. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming a true champion of the United States-Israel relationship, my friend and Senator, Senator Robert Menendez.
Buenos días, un placer darle la bienvenida a todos ustedes aquí, a la capital de la nación, en esta convención de esos que son pro Israel y pro los Estados Unidos. Thank you very much. For those of you who are terrorized, I might continue for the next few minutes in Spanish. Let me thank my dear friend Lonnie Kaplan for his gracious introduction. I'm honored to speak to so many with whom I have stood shoulder to shoulder for so long, sometimes against the odds, often against the broader international community, and sometimes at our own political peril. But we have always stood together when it comes to the security of the State of Israel, and it is one of the hallmarks of this organization. I'm especially honored this morning to share the stage with Prime Minister Netanyahu, a powerful voice for a strong, secure, and democratic Israel. He is the personification of the sentiment John Kennedy once expressed when he said, "Israel was not created in order to disappear. Israel will endure and flourish. It is the child of hope and the home of the brave. It carries the shield of democracy and it honors the sword of freedom." Like Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu was certainly not created to disappear. And I know with the shield of democracy in one hand and the sword of freedom in the other, he will inform and inspire us as he always has. One other reflection. I am proud to appear before AIPAC as the manifestation of what participatory democracy is all about, citizens seeking to petition their government. So when some criticize your motives, I would simply remind them of the first 3 words of the preamble of the Constitution of the United States that says, we the people, and that's who you all are. When I addressed this forum last year, I said that Israel and the United States have always agreed on the strategic imperative that Israel be able to defend itself no matter what blooms from the shifting sands of the Arab Spring. Now, 1 year later, I look at the world and I am deeply concerned. The spread of radical Islamic fundamentalism from the Hindu Kush to the Maghreb and across what King Abdullah called the Shia Crescent, the arc of unrest from the Gulf to the Mediterranean, has become a long winter of discontent that threatens an entire region and strengthens the worst players in the region. And it makes the regional and geopolitical outcome less predictable and increasingly dangerous for Israel and the United States. Israel is in an increasingly dangerous, unstable, and predictable neighborhood, making the strategic partnership with the United States even more imperative. Together, we are a pillar of regional stability. Together, we are shining examples of democratic values and the benefits a strategically deep partnership can bring. Together, Israel and the United States have much more than military allies. We have collaborated on science and technology, economic and agricultural issues, as well as on our security. But when it comes to military cooperation between our two nations, I'm proud to continue to take our security relationship with Israel to unprecedented levels. From the Iron Dome system that protects Israel from rocket attacks to rigorously ensuring Israel's qualitative military edge, all of us are safer and more secure because of that strategic relationship. Now, I have led the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in finding the best way forward in the region. On Syria, my committee's authorization for the use of military force last September was the reason Assad agreed to dismantle and destroy his regime's arsenal of chemical weapons. He decided to comply with the will of the international community only when he perceived U.S. military action to be imminent, clearly demonstrating that our willingness to use our military power can be a force for positive change. Let me say, sometimes hindsight is 20/20, and we may look back on that resolution as a missed opportunity to end the violence before it metastasized into an inoperable situation. Time will tell. Going forward, however, I think the United States must reassure its partners, particularly in the Gulf, that we will not take the military option off the table when that force can be used to achieve clearly defined national security outcomes. At the end of the day, I have led the committee in an effort to promote political and economic reform across the region and globally, with a willingness to project the strength of our military when necessary and the power of our values wherever and whenever democracy takes hold and people embrace the rule of law and good governance policies. I can assure you that I'll continue to lead the Foreign Relations Committee on the dual tracks of military power and the power of our democratic values embedded in the U.S.-Israel strategic partnership. In my view, both are needed if we are to protect our national security interests at home and the security of our friends around the world. And that, excuse me for one moment, simply I want to say that includes the security of the Ukraine. Let me say Russia's actions constitute a clear violation of international law and demand a swift and coordinated response from the international community to support Ukraine and counter Russian efforts to annex it. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee is, as we speak, developing a bipartisan legislative package to provide critical support to the Ukraine and, at the same time, pursue a menu of sanctions for those who violate international law. You must say what you mean and mean what you say, and that is what we intend to do. Now, I think most of you, I may not have obviously met each and every one of you, know me. You know what I stand for. You know what I believe in. And when it comes to Iran, I have stood with you and have stood against so many in my own party. Ladies and gentlemen, I have worked on Iran. I have worked Ladies and gentlemen, I have worked on Iran's nuclear issues for 21 years, starting when I was a member of the House, when I found out that the United States was sending voluntary contributions to the International Atomic Energy Administration, whose voluntary contributions above our membership dues were going to do what? To create operational capacity at the Bushehr nuclear facility, not in the national interest of the United States, not in the national interest of the State of Israel. For a decade, I was told that my concerns had no legitimate basis, that Iran would never be able to bring the Bushehr plant online, and that Iran's nuclear activities were not the most major concern. History has shown us that those assessments about Iran's abilities and intentions were simply wrong then, and I believe they are wrong today. If past is prologue, I'm skeptical of Iran keeping its promises. So let me give you my assessment of the way forward from the joint plan of action agreed to by the members of the P5+1 in Iran, and what we should expect before we move from an interim to a final comprehensive agreement that verifiably, and we would hope permanently, dismantles Iran's nuclear weapon program. As I have said repeatedly, I support a diplomatic progress program to get us to a deal. However, this diplomatic process must be reinforced by continuous international commitment to sanctions regime against Iran. It is clear that only intense, punishing economic pressure influences Iranian leaders. So we must keep the pressure on. We must not let them obstruct, and we can't let them obfuscate and delay their way to dismantling the sanctions that we have worked together to build, to bring them to the table, to get to the point of making sure they never have the ability to create one nuclear bomb. I certainly will continue to do all I can to make sure we do not dismantle the sanctions regime until and unless Iran dismantles their ability to create even one bomb. What troubles me, and what I believe troubles many of you, is that the international community seems to want any deal more than it wants a good deal. Let's understand that we need to ensure that Iran cannot delay away sanctions while they retain the ability to resume their weapons program at any time. The longer we let them delay, the swifter their research and development brings new, more powerful centrifuges, and the closer they get to breakout capability. And it is that capability that must be dismantled, period. Then we would have a good deal. We cannot let the international sanctions regime unravel before we have that better deal that verifiably dismantles Iran's ability to produce highly enriched uranium, a deal that fully addresses the weaponization aspects of Iran's nuclear program. The problem is that the mere possibility that sanctions might be lifted has already brought a rush of business delegations to Tehran. So let me be clear, I support the administration's diplomatic efforts. I've always supported a two-track policy of diplomacy and sanctions. But at the same time, I am convinced that we should only relieve pressure on Iran in exchange for verifiable concessions that will dismantle Iran's illicit nuclear program. And that we do that in a way that sends alarm bells from Vienna to Tel Aviv to Washington should Iran restart its program anytime in the next 20 or 30 years. And I'm here unequivocally to state my intention as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to make absolutely certain that any deal we may reach with Iran is verifiable, is effective, and prevents them from ever developing even one nuclear weapon. But based on the parameters described in the Joint Plan of Action and all I've heard in briefings and recent Iranian actions, I am very concerned. This is not a nothing ventured, nothing gained enterprise. We have placed our proven effective international sanctions on the line without clearly defining the parameters of what we expect in a final agreement. And that's why the letter that we have joined together in a bipartisan basis that I think many of you will be going to the Capitol to ask members to sign is incredibly important, because it outlines the essence of what that final agreement that would be acceptable is. To those who believe that if negotiations do not result in a deal, or if Iran breaks the deal, we can always impose new sanctions, let me be very clear. If negotiations fail, or if Iran breaks the deal, we may not have time to pass new sanctions. New sanctions are not a spigot that can be turned on and off as suggested. Even if Congress were to take up and pass new sanctions at the moment of Iran's first breach of the Joint Plan of Action, or if they do not reach an agreement that is acceptable, there will be a lag time of 6 months to bring those sanctions online, and at least a year for the real impact to be felt. And this would bring us, according to scientists that have testified before our committee, beyond the very short time that Iran would need to build a nuclear bomb, especially since the interim agreement does not require them to dismantle anything. It basically freezes their capability as it stands today. So let everyone understand, if there's no deal, I don't believe we will have sufficient time to effectively impose new sanctions before Iran could produce a nuclear weapon, leaving the West with only two options: a nuclear-armed Iran or a military action. I believe that we can prevent those being the only two options by the legislation that we have proposed with Senator Kirk in a bipartisan effort to prospectively create sanctions so that the Iranians will put that as part of their equation. In my view, Iran's strategy is to use these negotiations to mothball its nuclear infrastructure program just long enough to undo the international sanctions regime. Iran is insisting on keeping core elements of its program: enrichment, the Iraq heavy water reactor, the underground Fordo facility, the Parchin military complex. And while they may be subject to safeguards so that they can satisfy the international community in the short run, if they are allowed to retain their core infrastructure, they could revive their program sometime in the future. Bottom line, if they get their way, they dismantle virtually nothing. And we got the sanctions that are the one reason the Iranians are at the table at all. The fact is, Iran is simply looking to lock the door on its nuclear weapons program, and should they walk away later from the deal, as they have in the past, they can simply unlock the door and continue their nuclear weapons program from where they are today. And if that sounds familiar, it should. It sounds a lot like North Korea. And let's not forget that despite diplomatic entreaties to the Iranians in recent years, where hands were extended and secret talks were pursued, Iran has grown its support and advocacy for terror. The history of Iranian terror against U.S. citizens and interests is lengthy, robust, and grounded in the view that the United States is the great Satan. Its funding and support of Hezbollah, that has carried out attacks against American interests, continues. 241 American servicemen died in the 1983 Marine Corps barracks bombing in Lebanon, 19 in the Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia. In recent years, we've traced responsibility for lethal actions against American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as the planned attack on the Saudi ambassador in a Washington restaurant in 2011, all to Iran. Today, Iran is actively sponsoring the proxy war in Syria, spending money, weapons, and fighters every week, no, every day. Simultaneously, it is sponsoring attacks against Sunnis in Iraq and promoting regional sectarian violence that could easily result in a broader regional conflict. Make no mistake, while they are smiling at our negotiators across the table, they are plotting in the back room. With all of this in mind, I believe in the wisdom of the prospective sanctions that I have proposed. I believe in the lessons of history that tell us Iran cannot be trusted to live up to its word without external pressure. I believe that an insurance policy that guards against Iranian obfuscation and deception is the best way forward. The fact is, Iran's nuclear aspirations did not materialize overnight. Make no mistake, Iran views developing a nuclear capability as fundamental to its existence. It sees the development of nuclear weapons as part of a regional hegemonic strategy to make Tehran the center of power throughout the region. That is why our allies and partners in the region, not just Israelis, but Emiratis and Saudis and others, are so skeptical and so concerned. So while I welcome diplomatic efforts, and I share the hope that the administration can achieve a final comprehensive agreement that eliminates this threat to global peace and security, I am deeply, deeply skeptical based upon these 21 years of experience. At a minimum, we need to send a message to Iran that our patience is not unlimited, and a message to the international community that sanctions regime has not weakened, and this is not an opportunity to re-engage with Tehran. And in my view, it's time to put Iranian rhetoric to the test. If we are to take President Rouhani's word that he said in Davos that Iran does not seek nuclear weapons, if that's true, then the Iranian government should not have any problems with the obvious follow-up to that claim, starting with the verifiable dismantling of its illicit nuclear infrastructure. That is all the sanctions legislation seeks. I don't believe we should settle for anything less. Do any of you believe we should settle for anything less? So let me close by saying at the end of the day, we cannot know what the future will hold. We do not know what will bloom from the shifting sands of the Middle East. But what we do know, what we must understand, is that the United States must be the one to step up to help to protect the Israeli people and counter the threat that would be posed by a nuclear Iran. I have said many times before and will repeat here again, the Holocaust was the most sinister possible reminder that the Jewish population in exile was in constant jeopardy. It was a definitive argument that anti-Semitism could appear anywhere, and its horrors galvanized international support for the State of Israel. But while the Shoah may have a central role in Israel's identity, it is not the reason behind its founding, and it is not the main reason for its existence. The modern establishment of the State of Israel has long and deep roots going back to the times of Abraham and Sarah. There is no denying the Jewish people a legitimate right to live in peace and security in a homeland to which they have a connection for thousands of years, and that has not changed through the centuries. Too often, the past is truly prologue. And next week, on March 15th, is the start of Purim, a holiday that marks the deliverance of the Jewish people in the ancient empire of Persia, now Iran. As the story goes, a plot had been hatched to destroy all Jews in the Persian Empire, but Mordecai and his adopted daughter Esther foiled the plot, and the day of deliverance became a day of celebration and feasting. The parallel is all too obvious when it comes to the situation today in the Middle East and the protection of the Israeli people from the threat posed by a nuclear Iran. Let us pray that if that time should come, together we will be like Mordecai and Esther, and we shall fail and foil Iran's nuclear threat and deliver the Jewish people again, as well as to protect the world from a nuclear threat. That is our prayer, and that is what we are going to work to achieve. Shalom.